You're still muted.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So, Jessica, I'm going to need your help this week, I hope, because I don't have the shear that's fully thought out, fully worked out, and I'm a little out of shape at Tanakh. So, Nach especially. So by all means, pitch in, I hope, and tell me when things make sense, what we think things mean, thing like that. I'm going to share a screen. The topic for this week is the Haftarah, and the connection between the Haftarah and the Parsha is pretty straightforward at the outset, right? Because the Haftarah begins the beginning of Hoshea. That begins Hayam Mispar Bnei Yisrael Kechol Hayam Asher Lo Yimad V'Lo Yisafer. So the number of Bnei Yisrael will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. So there is a paradox that some Rishonim note that if it is a number, why can't it be measured or counted? There are easy ways of dealing with it, which is to say that it's a very large number, such that human beings cannot count it, although it is in fact countable. Some people have fun bringing in the question of whether infinites actually exist or not, and some people try and come up with other ways of claiming there are stages where it's countable and stages where it's not countable. That is not really our issue this week, although it would be fun. Generally, I guess biblical number theory would be a lot of fun. From the fact that is the connection to this week's Haftarah, the presumption is that this is a positive verse, and it's easy to imagine why you would think of it as a positive verse, because after all, what could be better than having Mispar Bnei Yisrael Kechol Hayam Asher Lo Yimad V'Lo Yisafer. And here we could talk, that's probably right, but we can also talk about perhaps the difference between what you might call canonical meaning and contextual meaning, that there are psukim that mean certain things, certain interpretations of them are adopted in certain kinds of contexts. That doesn't mean that we think that is the pshat or the meaning of the verse in all contexts, or that's the primary meaning. It's the meaning that is useful in this context. So as a liturgical meaning, it's clear that Havayam Mispar Bnei Yisrael Kechol Hayam is an absolute positive. Some of you who are of a midrashic mind may already be thinking about, by Abraham, always two metaphors, Chol Hayam and Kochvei Hashemayim. Why does this pasuk use Chol Hayam and not Kochvei Hashemayim? And usually when people think of that, then usually Kochvei Hashemayim is more positive than Chol Hayam. So maybe there is a certain degree of ambivalence in this verse. So we want to put that seed in your mind at the outset. I'm going to move to an example that is central for me, I guess, in the way I think about certain things in Tanakh. I'll start, I guess, by saying that one of my teachers in Tanakh was Professor Yeshayahu Maori, and the way he taught because of the limitations of time in a graduate school classroom was, and this had a deep influence on me, he would try and find the fulcrum, right? The pasuk that the way you interpreted that would ramify through your interpretation of the whole section of Tanakh. And for me, my favorite example of that is not an example Professor Maori gave me, but it's one I found on my own, but I'm sure many have found it before me, is in Haftarah, Zacharti lach chesed nurayich avat kulatayach, lechteich acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zeruah, toward the very beginning of Yirmiyahu. So the canonical meaning of it, the reason that it's there in Haftarah beyond question, is I have remembered for your sake, Zacharti lach chesed nurayich, the chesed that you did to me when you were a nara. The love you showed for me when you were a kala. Right? How did you express that? Or while you followed me in the desert, be'eretz lo zeruah, in an unsown land. Right. So this was right, and this is sort of the counterpoint to much of Yirmiyah, and it's really important canonically to understand. Right, that's the role Haftarah plays. Is that that the whole book is organized around that no matter how much anger is expressed by God through Yirmiyahu at the Jews in the book, but he will always remember, right, always remember the honeymoon. I'm sure it's also been there, in various kinds of marriage counseling experiences. So the other interpretation, which should not be in marriage counseling experiences and not canonical, and I think it's probably not pshat, but it's an example of how a whole book can change because we interpret one verse is the Radak understands that verse as right, not as I have remembered for your sake. That's not what Zacharti Lach means. It means I have reminded you. I have caused you to remember, or actually not successfully caused you to remember. I've reminded you of the chesed that I did for you when you were in Ar, the love I showed to you when you were a Kala, when you were wandering after me in a unsown land, so you could have starved to death. Right. So and actually in that way the whole verse is part of the Tochacha, and I think that that when I taught Yirmiyah many years ago, I think I showed that Radak has a completely different vision of the whole Sefer. It permeates all the way through, in that he does not see the desert as in Radak's vision, like the problems in the marriage started early, as opposed to there's this thing we can always cling to. So I much prefer the other interpretation, but it's just, and I think that's obviously not the canonical meaning and probably not the contextual meaning either, but it's a way in which an entire section can change based on how you understand one verse. So I was trying to figure out what my entree into this Haftorah was. So I think that to understand this Haftorah, you have to see it in the context of at least the first two prakim of Hoshea. And that's, I don't know that we need that much more of it, though I don't know much more of it, so we'll have to see that. And I wanted to focus on one particular word, which is the word Yizrael. Okay, Israel is not Yisrael, although obviously the echoes are there, and so it'd be very hard to use the word without thinking that there's some kind of illusion. And the word Yisrael shows up 5 times, I believe it is, in the first two prakim. So we're going to take you through the first two prakim briefly in an outline and show you where Yisrael shows up, and then we'll go through some of the Rishonim and see the different ways in which they understood this, and see if that shapes our vision of the whole. Okay, so Hoshea has a very long and introduction which sets the time of this. Right, it occurred in Uziyahu, Yotam, Achazi, Chizkiyahu, Malchei Yehuda, and Yeravim ben Yoash Melech Yisrael. So we're dated in both monarchies. And then, sort of an oddity, it says Tchilat Diber Hashem Hoshea, and then it says Vayomer Hashem el Hoshea. Let's assume that this is actually the beginning of Hoshea, that this is actually the beginning of God's speech with Hoshea. And although, again, at least for the purpose of this book, let's suppose this is the first thing that this is this is chronologically the first nevuah in the book. Maybe a reasonable assumption. It may not be true, but let's take a reasonable assumption. So Hashem says to Hoshea to go take an Eshet Zerunim v'Yaldei Zerunim, Gizanot Tizneh Haaretz Me'acharei Hashem. Right. So Hoshea is told to take a wife who either will be wayward or has committed adultery, and does it mean children she already has, or the children she's about to have? Very, very odd instruction. Is this real? Is this a dream? All questions that don't matter to us right now. We can just see the pattern is that he's supposed to take an Eshet Zerunim, and that's because Anoti is Neha Aretz. So she's described the way there's a symbolic description in which Zerunim presumably refers to some kind of infidelity, and that's because it's stated in the future, although it's not clear why it's in the future, that the land will stray from after God or is straying after God. Challenging to figure out what the timeline of this is relative to the date line in Pasagala. So he goes, he takes his Gomer Bas Divlayim. Now, we are not told explicitly in the text that Gomer Bas Divlayim is an Eshet Zerunim or what that would mean, but it seems like the easiest way of understanding contextually is that Gomer Bas Divlayim is a woman of not irreproachable character, and she gives him a bain who may or may not be a fulfillment of Yaldei Zerunim or another child. And so now God told him what to do, and he did it. Now, Vayomer Hashem Elah, God says to him, Kira Shemo Yisrael. Call the name of this first child you have from Gomer Bas Divlayim, call him Yisrael. Why? Ki'od ma'at, because it's just a little bit ahead. Ufakati et demei Yisrael al Beit Yehu. And I will take the blood of, I will remember the blood of Israel al Beit Yehu. So to figure out what al means there, and also what pakad means, the instinct which most Rishonim will take is that I will take vengeance for, I'll remember the blood of Israel, and I will take his vengeance out on Beit Yehu. And therefore, by wiping out Yehu, I will wipe out the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes. And on that day, presumably the day in which he is pokad on Beit Yehu, the blood of Yisrael, I will break the keshet Yisrael. I'll break the bow of Israel. That presumably is some reference to military strength, although not necessarily, but presumably. Be'emek Yisrael. Okay, so now we know that we have three references to Yisrael. Yisrael is the name of the child. That's a symbolic thing. What is it symbolic of? Well, there are two things it's symbolic of. One, it's symbolic of the blood of Israel, which has not been identified for us. And two, it's named after a place. Emek, God, because God will destroy the keshet of Israel in Emek Yisrael. And we could figure out, midah keneged midah, that God will destroy the keshet of Israel in Emek Yisrael because, it's in some way related to Demei Yisrael. So the most likely candidate for Demei Yisrael is in Melachim Bet Perik Yud, where it says, Vayach Yehu et kol hanisharim levet achav b'Yisrael. So Yehu wipes out all the remaining descendants of the prior monarchy, the house of Achav in Israel. The Chol Gedolav Mida'av, and all the nobles of the court, the Kohanav and all his priests who are presumably Kohanei Habal, or his Achav, Beit Achav is famous for its Avodah Zarah. Ad bilti hishir lo sarid, right? There's nothing left, right? There is a massacre. So it's very easy to say Ufakati Demei Yisrael al Beit Yehu, meaning that I will take revenge on the house of Yehu for their wiping out the house of Achav. The problem is that Achav is not a positive character. Achav is sort of an ultra negative character in terms of Avodah Zarah. He's one of the characters like Satan in Paradise Lost, who in his rebellion against God develops one can develop a certain sympathy for the devil, but that's not but that doesn't show up as a direct schar ba'onish thing in Tanakh. And moreover, Yehu is anointed for the sole purpose, right? God predicts it, and then afterwards God even says Yasher Koach to Yehu for wiping out Beit Achav. So on the one hand, that's the most likely candidate for Demei Yisrael, and on the other hand, it seems pretty clear that bad things are going to happen to Beit Yehu. And why should bad things happen to Beit Yehu? For the thing they did that was God predicted, God endorsed, God approved, God endorsed. So that's a deep puzzle in terms of the meaning of Yisrael. Okay, so then, there's another child. This child is called the daughter is called Lo Ruchama. And why is she called Lo Ruchama? Because God will no longer be merachem at Beit Yisrael. We always have to be careful whether Beit Yisrael here, Beit Yisrael here means the 10 tribes, because and then there's complete ambiguity here about what Beit Judah Arachem below it, right? But at least Lo Ruchama symbolizes at least the kingdom of Israel, and God will no longer have that relationship, the relationship of Rachamim with Beit Yisrael. That could mean I will no longer have mercy, or very likely here is one of the places where Rachamim is a very clear pun on mercy and womb. Beit Yisrael really means I will no longer regard Beit Yisrael as my child. Okay, all right. I think that's part of it, of this being a daughter. Okay, you can buy that or not buy it. Okay, all right. So now that life goes on, and there's another son, and this son is supposed to be called Lo Ami. Right? Call Lo Ami because you will no longer be my Ami, and then I will not be your what? Presumably, right? Presumably, I will no longer be your God, whatever that means. But although that part of it is not, except by implication, if you are not my nation, then I am not your God. Right? That part of it is not in the name. Okay, so you have 3 children: Yisrael, Lo Ruchama, and Lo Ami. None of this has any element of cheer in it at all, as you can tell. Right? This is right. All of this is unrelieved disaster. All the children are at least seem to be about disaster. Right? One of them ends the Shavar Tia Keshet Yisrael. One of them is Lo Arachem, and one of them is Lo Ami. And then we move off and we say, oh, and by the way, Vaya mispar bnei Yisrael kechol hayam shelo yimad v'lo yisafer. Vaya Bimkom asher yamer lehem lo amiatem, yamer lehem b'nei el chai. So there's a really abrupt mood change. Now there is a partial break, so we could say, okay, there's a really abrupt mood change, but what generates that abrupt mood change? Why is it here? And that abrupt mood change is embodied in, it seems, right? And so your numbers will be enormous, and let's take the simplest meaning in the place bimkom in place, which the simplest meaning of it in context is probably instead of, right? In place of saying to them lo amiatem, in place of having it be said to them lo amiatem, they will be called b'nei el chai. It can also be in the place, right? We have to figure out what that means, and there's a grammatical problem here because it's mekom asher yamer lehem, in place of it being said to them, you are not my nation, right? So it's being said to them in the passive, and you are not my nation of a direct address. Instead, yamer lehem, it will be said to them b'nei el chai. So that's no longer direct address, right? It doesn't say banai. So that's a little bit of an issue here also. Okay, so but it still sounds like it could the easiest reading of this, which is again the canonical meaning is, right? There will be lots and lots and lots of Bnei Yisrael, and now they will, instead of being called Lo Ami, they will be called Bnei El Chai. V'nikmitzu Bnei Yehuda Bnei Yisrael yachdav, and now Yehuda and Yisrael get together. Why Yehuda needs to be gotten together? Because we haven't heard anything about destruction to Yehuda yet. That right is because up here it's sort of ambiguous what happens to Yehuda. It sounds like they're going to be lo Hoshea b'kesher l'cheref milchama v'susim v'torashim, but it is arachem. But something happened to Yehuda meanwhile also, so that Bnei Yehuda and Bnei Yisrael get together. V'samalhem rosh echad, and they will appoint a single head. Ve'alu min haaretz, and they will go up from the land. Ki gadol yom Yisrael. Okay, so ve'alu min haaretz is a little bit problematic because we really want it to keep on being positive, and everything looks great, right? There are lots of us, and God is now saying Bnei El Chai. Let's suppose everybody's getting together. There's Achdus, and and there's Rosh Echad, Alu min haaretz. Which haaretz? And if you're going to tell me, right, it means they're going to leave places, other places, and go to Eretz Yisrael. Hang on a sec, right? It's Alu min haaretz, right? Shouldn't there be Alu la haaretz, right? Isn't it rhetorically the case that Eretz Yisrael is Gavoa mikol haaretzot? So that you always talk about going on Aliyah, Eretz Yisrael. So how can we talk about going on Aliyah from? Right. So if they're already in Israel, this is a bit challenging. And if they're not in Israel, right? So when they get to not being in Israel, they're in Israel now. Right. So you can see obviously there's a movement to there's a inclination to say, you know what, we suddenly skipped a long way in the future. Over here we're still talking about the present and what's going to happen to the kingdom of the kingdom of Israel. And that's what all these children are symbolizing the present. And then all of a sudden we skip, who knows how many thousands of years in the future, and we have this sudden depiction of the Messianic era. Okay, now here's the interesting thing about this, right? So when all this happens, maybe it's Kibbutz Goliath, maybe, right? It says Ki Gadol Yom Yisrael. Now, what is Yom Yisrael? The only mention we have of Israel so far here is Israel. Israel is a place where you take revenge for the blood of Israel, and it's also the place where Keshet Yisrael is broken. So, what on earth does Yom Yisrael mean here? So that's a puzzle, right? That's our fourth use of Israel. If we see this entire section as positive, then you have to make this positive, but why would Yom Yisrael be positive? Okay, that's the problem. Okay, we go on, then really it's very hard to figure out what comes next. Say to your brothers, my nation, and and you're right. So that's obviously an inversion of Lo Ami and Lo Ruchama. Who says it? And then it switches to Rivu Bimchem, Rivu Kihilo Ishti, right? So you move from a great, you can welcome your brother and your sister and call them and take away the negatives for the name, but then you're fighting with your mother. I put in a line break here, but there's no paragraph break in Tanakh as we have it. Really, really puzzling. And within two psukim, right, we're talking about humiliating the mother and B'nei Lo Arachem. And I'm not going to break. So we're B'nei Zunim Hema. So everything, right? So the whole point of it was negative again. So we could say, you know what? There was a 3 or 4 pasuk, depending how you interpret this, 3 or 4 pasuk break here, where everything was positive, and then we just switch back And there's no context at all. We have to figure out what Yisrael could mean to do that, right? That's the challenge. We have the grammatical issue here. We have Chol Hayam as opposed to Kochvei Shemayim, so it's not 100% clear. If we want to do that, right, and that's what we want to do, I think, clearly in the Haftarah, then we have to figure out what Yom Yisrael could mean. That means something very different than the day of Pekidat Damim and the day of Shvirat Keshet in Israel. Okay, well, we go on with a whole bunch of really not happy stuff, really happy stuff. But then at the end over here, right, this is all right. Talking about talking about how there's going to be famine and everything because Israel are the unfaithful wife. We have something like Yirmiyahu, right? That there's a seduction. I will take her out to the desert. I will speak to her heart, and then great things happen again, right? So this section over here, the end of we have another positive section introduced, and we have great cheer here, right? Hashem, fine, right? So there's another positive introduction. So okay, so maybe we just have mood shifts. And then we have Yamahu, whatever that day is, right? But it seems like a really good day, right? So the end of the previous section is, right, the Olam, Tzedek Mishpat, Rachamim, Bemunah, V'yadas Es Hashem, right? So at the end, God is remarrying us, or marrying us for the first time. Everyone understands it. Context, it seems like remarrying, leaving aside the halachic questions of whether remarrying a wife who's committed adultery, which all the Nevi'im have to deal with, whether you take the halachic metaphor quite so seriously, or how you deal with it, or does God violate the halacha, however you want to understand it. But Yamahu that we get right on that day, whatever that day is, right, it's the second consecutive Yamahu. So probably if it's the same Yamahu, that's a really good day, and maybe that's the same good day as Yom Yisrael. And then Hashem Tashamayim. So not clear what Enem means here. Behem Yanu et Aretz. Okay, let's suppose that Shemayim is the Haim. Still, we don't know, right? There's some kind of response between God, heaven, and earth. Let's suppose that this really means that the most likely thing here is that the land will respond by giving forth its grain. Okay, right? So God in some way cues the heavens, and the heavens in some way cue the earth, and the earth cues the grain and the grapes and the oil and the olives. The Haim Yanuit Yisrael. What does that mean? Last we know, Israel is not really a kind of food. So I don't know, right? We have a progression: God, heaven, earth, grain. It's not like we're going all the way down. Well, that way, should we go down to earth and we start weighing up? Now we've got the grains there. What is Israel? No idea what Israel is. Okay, it was Ratiha li ba'aretz, and I will plant. Seems like her, so that's a bit of a challenge as to there are no feminine descriptions previously, so that's a bit of a challenge. Okay, Zratiha li ba'aretz, I will write this, and it sounds like Zratiha is a pun on Yisrael, right? Because Yisrael could mean, or Yisrael, right? Yisrael here, but it sounds like it means that this is what God will sow, and now God will sow them. Now we're back to the cheerful thing, right? The lo ruchama now is so here, it seems pretty clear that whatever Yisrael is a very positive thing. It was Ratia li ba'aretz. Okay, so in the end of the day, we have here 5 uses of Yisrael. Okay, we'll go through them. The first one, Hirashima Yisrael, is connected to, it's a symbolic name that plainly is connected to 2 negative things: the revenge of the blood of Israel and the destruction of the might of Israel, the bow of Israel in Emek Yisrael. Then there's an ambivalent one, Gadol Yom Yisrael, that's probably positive but not obvious why it is. And at the end, there are 2 that are very hard not to take positively, right? This is talking about the revival of the land. There's one here, right? It's only one, right? But it's clear here that it's a revival of the land, so it has to be positive. So 1 symbolic, 2 obviously negative, 1 obviously positive, and 1 ambivalent or ambiguous. Okay, and in the section we have switches back and forth, right? Are you lo ruchama? Are you ruchama? Very hard to know. Nobody has named their child lo ruchama in a long time, though. Although of course there are children named ruchama. I imagine you have to say no to them sometimes, so that could be problematic. But okay, you understand what the problems are. Okay, so let's take a look at the way the Targum, whichever Targum it is. I have not looked up what the official position is right now and how old the Targum Yonatan is or by whom. Let's just take it as the classical Jewish attempted translation. How do you translate the word Yisrael in these 5 places in this Targum? So here we go. So Amar Hashem lei, so God said to him, Kirashimhun mivadraya. Call the first child's name, scattered. Okay, so instead of leaving Israel as an untranslatable thing, it means really lizarot, right, which is to scatter, as opposed to lizroa, which is to sow. Why? Aryeh od sivchar, because just a little bit. V'asar dam palche ta'avasa adashad yehu b'Yisrael. All right, and I will come in revenge the blood that Yehu spilled in Israel. What? The Katlinan al deflacho levala, because he killed Achab for serving the Baal. I gotta say, what's negative about that? Tavu inun limitai basar eglaya de beveisel. But Yehu and his descendants, they return shavu, right? They return tavu inun, they return the mitai to stray after the Egel in Beit El, right? So they worship their own Egel Zahav. The Egel Zahav originally put up by Yeravam ben Nevat to create a separate cultic place in the separate competitor to Beit HaMikdash in the Malchut Yisrael. Therefore, because the descendants of Yehu committed their own acts of Avodah Zarah, just like the descendants of Achav, Achshavine dam zakai al Beit Yehu. Therefore, I consider the wiping out of the house of Achav as if the house of Yehu had killed innocents, because what right did the house of Yehu to kill the house of Achav if they were going to be just as bad afterwards? Right. So that's how the Targum solves the problem. How can the blood of Israel be something that deserves revenge, even if they were told to do it? The answer is that Yehu wiping out Achav, we were told to do it, but it's conditional, right? That's a really powerful theological notion, right? That you can be told to do it, and yet if you don't act properly afterwards, the meaning of your action is converted from righteous zealotry to murder. That's a really powerful idea, I think. Okay, and then that here, right, the third time they say, what does it mean? So the power of those who make war for Israel will be destroyed, will be broken. Then Meshar Yisrael. So the Targum kind of it turns Israel into a place. So I think that the answer is, well, we already explained why the blood of Achav deserves revenge, and then it makes sense, midah keneged midah, that the blood of Achav will be revenged in the place where it was spilled. Okay, so we got 3, right? So far, Yisrael means scattered, and Yisrael means it means the place referring to the incident of the massacre of Achav's descendants, and Israel means that very same place where the Jews will be broken, and presumably that's why that question is, so why would we call the child Yisrael? So the answer is, we call the child Israel because the Jews will be scattered. That is God's revenge for Israel, is that the Jews become mivadraya. Okay, and then, so what happens at the end? So the Jews turn into sand, right? Sand of the seashore that can't be counted, and the hibis asra is gileu b'nei amamayim. So when the Jews are exiled among the nations, karavru alaraita, right? Because they violated the Torah. Itamar lahon lo amiaton. So then the non-Jews amongst whom the Jews are exiled will say, right? So actually, it was first place, right? We said bimkom. He bi'atra. So in the place, right? It doesn't say in place of, right? It's not a substitution. It's in the very place where the Jews were exiled amongst the nations because they violated the Torah, and where the non-Jews said to them, or where God said to them, right? God said to them, "You are not my nation." Yituvun v'yitrabun, they will return and they will multiply. And they will be told, Amed el hakayama, right? So it's the place where God told them that you are not my nation. They will now be told by the people where God exiled them, no, you are God's nation. And so all get together. Rosh Chad mean Beit David, and they're going to appoint one head, meaning a Davidic monarch. So Beit Yisrael will rejoin with Beit Yehuda. And they will go up from the land, right? So from the land of their galut. Okay, that's fine. Arei Rav Yom Kinishton. Okay, so that was a really interesting claim, right? Because we just said up here that Yisrael was scattered, and here Yisrael means gathering. That's a little bit of a challenge, right? Because we understand, right? So we found an etymology that would get, because Lazarot is to scatter. So Yisrael, right? Well, it has an ayin, but the ayin, right? We can ignore the ayin and say it's the place where God scatters them. But how do we get Yom Kinishton to mean the day of their gathering? Right? How do you get Yom Yisrael to mean gathering? That's a little bit of a puzzle to me. Okay, so the land will respond to it, right, with wine, oil, and the Inyanis Takon legalot ami. And let's take, what are we translating as the Inyanis Takon legalot ami? Going back to the pasuk. Have here. Right, so at the Jerusalem Behem Yanuit Yisrael. Okay, so Yanuit Yisrael, the last time that the Targum tells us is so Israel means gathering, exile, and right, scattered. Israel means scattered, gathering, and exile. So you can see what the Targum is trying to do is it's trying to read the Sukkim the way that seems most likely, that that there are these places where it becomes a positive, and so up here, right, Israel, right, when they leave, so Israel, right, Yom Yisrael is a positive, and therefore here when we feed Israel, that must be a positive also. But in order to do that, it has to get the word Israel to mean Knishton here, and to mean Galut Ami here, right? So we can say what it really means is the exiles who are gathered. Still a challenge. And now the next thing in the pasuk is, right? Remember we had said the Vehem Yanud Yisrael, Uzratihali, and I will plant her. So there's a pun on Yisrael and Yizra, to sow. And this is completely missing in the Targum. And I will establish you in the land of my Shekhinah. So that's how the Targum tried to do it. It has 4 separate translations for Yisrael. It chooses to translate the name the first time. It chooses to, right? It doesn't translate it in. It just gives it as a place the next 2 times. Then it translates as gathered. Then it translates it as exiles. It all makes sense in context, but you lose what seems to be the literary theme. You lose the pun of Zara here. All in all, I don't know how successful an effort this is. Okay, Rashi gives you a number of, Rashi largely quotes the Targum for the first several examples. Then he Rashi's bothered by the sudden transition to Vayam Mispar. So here are Rashi's several explanations for why we have the sudden shift at the beginning of Perek Bet, where we have our Haftarah. What's going on here to have, right, in one sentence, right, destruction and consolation? The Rabbi Aryeh Klapper, so he says Chazal explained in Psachim, and he's giving you the end of a long discussion. Yergish Hoshea be'asmo shechata. That Hoshea recognized himself that he had sinned. How had he sinned? So Chazal say that at some point, and it's not clear, but because they put this, at least initially, they put this before the first Chilat Deber Hashem be'Hoshea, right? So that's why it's challenging, because Chazal have Hoshea having a conversation with God before that ever happens, and God telling Hoshea, go take an Eshet Ziduniyim, at least the beginning of that sugya, means that God is saying this in response to something Hoshea has previously said to him. And the thing that he has previously said to him, or the thing that he says to him in the flow of it, and I haven't done it enough to see whether there's a transition, or whether there's or whether somehow there's a more complicated time scheme. But at some point, Hoshea says to God, you know what? You should just switch the Jews out for somebody else. And God says to him, no, I don't want to do that. And in a sense, God tells Hoshea to marry Gomer Bas Divlaim so that eventually Hoshea will understand how difficult it can be to send, right, to switch a relationship in which you've already invested, even if in fact objectively your partner is not really living up to their side of the bargain. Okay, right? That's one way of reading the Chazal. So Hoshea, right? So probably the way to read it, although again it's challenging, and at the end of the sugya that seems to be right. That God tells Hoshea that the first parak is essentially Hoshea telling God you can switch them, and then we have this shift at the end when Hoshea realizes he was wrong and prays to God for Rachamim. That's when he says V'yam Mispar Bnei Yisrael. But it's really hard to make the first parak be Hoshea's expression as opposed to God telling him. We can make right. So it's really hard to fit this into that I can tell to pshat, although maybe somebody else can do it afterwards. Okay, second pshat. It says the Sifrei Devei Rav, parts of the age of Yisrael B'Shutim, Shaninu, Rebbe Omer, Yesh Parshiot Smuchot Zulazu. There are parshiot that are literally juxtaposed. But in terms of theme, they're as far apart as you can imagine, east and west. Here's an example. Right? That's the end of Perek Aleph. You are not my nation. And the very next phrase, oh, that's really good. Right? What are these connected? So he gives a wild metaphor, which is another marriage metaphor, and yet it doesn't seem to relate to the story of Gomer Bat Divlaim at all. Mashal Melech Sheka'as al Ishto. So it's the king who gets mad at his wife. Shalach Acher HaSofer, and so he calls the scribe Lavov Lichtov Laget to write her a divorce. Actual Bas Sofer, but before the Sofer shows up, Nidratzeh Melech Lishto, the king changes his mind. Why the king changes his mind is not part of the metaphor. He changes his mind because he was wrong. He changed his mind because he was right, but he can't do it. Not at all. Changed his mind because his wife did something. No knowledge. Amar Melech, then the king says something really odd. If Shar Yitzeh Sofer Zem Mikan Chaluk, will the Sofer here leave smoothly with no impression? So what does that mean? Like, why shouldn't the Sofer leave with no impression? So we could interpret it to say, look, I bothered him to do something, and I took his time, so I should give him a job. So that he, right? But the Sifrei is taking a little bit more substantively, at least the way Rashi understands it. Kilomar libo chaluk v'tohen lomar lama shalach acharav. But the problem is not that we're taking advantage of the Sofer, and we could just give them the money, but people feel uncomfortable when they take it. But if they take money for work they didn't actually do it. But it's also, right, this is going to embarrass the king and his wife because there'll be tabloid reports, everyone's going to know the Sofer was pulled and the Sofer didn't write anything. So everyone's going to speculate, it must have been that the king was planning to divorce his wife and now he's not. So instead, he says, Amarlo, boch tov lo shani kopel l'aktubata. So he says, I called you here so that you could double her ketubah, right? So that the tabloid stories will read the exact opposite. I'm assuming the Sofer doesn't know why he was pulled originally, because that sounds like okay. So that's what Rashi, right? So that's what is going on here, is that the emotional shift is in God. That God, right? The first parak, right? So one way of reading it is that the first, right, is that Hoshea is the one who originally calls for God to divorce Bnei Yisrael, and then Hoshea realizes he sinned, and so Vayam Mispar Bnei Yisrael is Hoshea's recognition of his sin. That's the position in Psachim. The Sifri says no. Hoshea is not expressing his own emotions, and what we're following is not the change in emotions of Hoshea. We're following the change in emotions can be the whole of God. And the first parak, right? God first tells Hoshea, go write a bill of divorce for Bnei Yisrael. And then he changes his mind. And he tells Hoshea, no, actually, you know what? Right, write a ketubah instead. So that's a very beautiful metaphor. That's why Hoshea suddenly shifts. There's a gap in that Hoshea, it's hard to view Hoshea as a scribe who doesn't know why he was called, because Hoshea said these words. So that's a very odd, and they're obviously negative. So it's a fascinating depiction of the way you have God's emotions with no justification for the change other than emotion. But as a way of mapping it onto the psukim, it seems to me that there's a flaw, which is that Hoshea is too knowledgeable. He knows enough to know that he's writing. You could imagine that maybe Hoshea has trances, he doesn't write, but it's a challenging thing. Okay, then Rashi says, I don't think that either Psachim or the Zifri is actually pshat of what's going on here. But I think the pshat is Getem lo ami v'nochilo yelachem. At the end of Perek Aleph is Er'e atzmi kilu ani lachem. I will pretend, I will create the image that I am not yours. The Tiglu levein ha'umot, and you'll go be exiled. Asham tirbu v'tismechu, and even there you will multiply and be and sprouts. V'sham teshuva levachem l'shuv elai, and there you'll do tshuva. Moshe Amar Lidei Moshe, right? So, right, when you go to exile, then God will eventually return you. Yafkam niknesu behudav bnei Yisrael yachtav. So here too, right? Rosh Hashanah, we go into Messianic era, and that's a very beautiful pshat. We pointed out the ways you can do it, but there's something obviously missing, which is that Hoshea never mentions anything about tshuva. We have kibbutz goliot. That's very beautiful. It's a very clear connection. But if the whole shift is is that I will do this, that the reason that things shift between the end of Perek Aleph and the beginning of Perek Bet is that tshuva happened. It would have been nice if we had some description of tshuva, but there's no notion, there's nothing of the tshuva mentioned in the pasuk. So the Rashi's explanation is not an enormously successful explanation of the smichut either. Okay, Rashi tries to fit in Yisrael is b'nei hagolah, right? So he has a target, but he fits in shenizru v'nikpetzu. Okay, why is Yisrael symbolized b'nei hagolah coming back? Because they were sown and reaped. Like, that's very great, but the reaping is much more important than the sowing, so not so great. Okay, then he tries. Okay, Zratihali. So what does it mean that I will plant her? So we say in the end, right? So there's famous Chazal that the purpose of exile was for the Jews to acquire converts. So Rashi says that's what Zratihali means, that I will plant them so that I can gather more. So it's a rather ironic way of thinking about conversion as sowing, because conversion is dafka not biological. Okay, it's not descendants. Again, I don't see this as an enormously successful effort. Okay, but that's what we have. Okay, Rav Yosef Kara, this is the evil French person, right? Not Rav Yosef Kara, the author of Shulchan Aruch. So he has just pointed out that Israel doesn't have to refer just to specific incidents. Shomron hu Yisrael, that Shomron is the capital of the 10 tribes, and he thinks that's the same as Israel. So there's some ambiguity about that, whether they're nearby or not, or the same place, but he thinks that Israel is always a symbol for the 10 tribes. Okay, that's a nice point. At least in some places it might help. Okay, then he says, you know what? Israel, he says, you know what? All these fancy explanations that the Medrash and Rashi give, trying to explain the transition from negative to positive, and we're portraying either the prophet's emotions or God's emotions or the sweep of history. No, none of that. What we're talking about is a literary habit in Tanakh, which is that whenever there's really harsh rebuke with a couple of punishments, just a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Right? So this is just a feature of Tanakh. It's not live. It's not giving you a picture. Right? It's expressing that there's always the purpose of Tochacha in Tanakh is not to make the listener feel hopeless. There's always got to be right. So on the one hand, it gives you an insight into the whole nature of Tanakh. You have to decide for yourself if that's always true. Right? Is it true that there's always a shtickle of Nechama? To some extent, that goes back to our conversation about Yirmiyah. Although there certainly is Nechama and Yirmiyah regardless. But it sort of saps the meaning. That means you just look at it and say, "Oh, okay, yeah, it's time for that bit of Nechama." There's nothing literally interesting about the location, at all. And he points out that there is it seems like that part of the theme going on here is that while Shomron is Yisrael, that eventually Yisrael and Beit Judah get together, and so maybe for him, right, the way we can understand the movement here is Yisrael initially means Shomron, and at the end, in the Messianic era, because of Rosh Hashanah, Yisrael comes to stand for the nation sown by God, and so it represents both Yisrael and Beit Yehuda together. Right? So that's an interesting literary move about the word Yisrael. I think that's probably what emerges from Yosef Karo. Okay, Ibn Ezra is the dark figure here. Ibn Ezra says, "Vayah mispar b'nei Yisrael, Amar kizeh pasuk lo ne'amar kim l'gnai." I say, I know everyone else thinks this pasuk is positive, Ibn Ezra says, and if you're reading the Haftarah, I think you would agree that's how you should read it. But he says, in terms of what he thinks is really going on, this is negative. Kishrabu hara'im, Amar Navi vayah mispar b'nei Yisrael hara'im kichol hayam. Right. So he thinks that the mispar b'nei Yisrael is not celebrate how many Jews there are, is how many bad Jews there are, or how many averos, right? The mispar b'nei Yisrael is the number of the sins committed by the Jews, right? So, and he thinks that as opposed to yamer lehem b'nei el chai, meaning that other people or God Himself will tell you you're now b'nei el chai, he thinks yomru latzmam, right? This is all that this three pasuk thing is not a positive at all. This is all just negative, and it's talking about the multitude of their sins and their egos. Right? Ibn Ezra is right. He says ki gadol, right? So Samalahem Rosh Echad. What does Rosh Echad mean? Zeu Sancherev, who is going to lead Israel out into exile, right? But ki gadol Yom Israel means Yom Shenifkad Avon Beit Israel B'nei Hakol Lignai Below the Sheva. Okay, but there seems to be almost a certain amount of glee in jumping up and down on people's usual interpretation of this as a cheerful section. Right, Ibn Ezra has a bunch. Right, we don't have time to do the detailed work about how you get Gadol Yom Israel. Is it Mi Israel, Ki Israel, Yom Israel itself? But Ibn Ezra's key point here is that don't think of this, right, as opposed to Rabbi Yosef Karo, who said, you know what? So it doesn't seem to fit in context. So what? The interspersion of negative and positive in Tanakh has nothing to do with context. It's just every once in a while you need to say something sweet. Ibn Ezra says, nope, there's nothing sweet about this. And he says, what about at the end, right, where it seems like there is positive stuff? Well, he says, at the very end, we get to the deep future, and he even says, maybe it's right, maybe it's even, it's if they repented, it's not even a prediction. Okay, Ibn Ezra is unreserved darkness. Okay. If we get to Rav Yosef ibn Kaspi. Rav Yosef ibn Kaspi, first of all, comes up with a great chap. He says, you know what? Everyone assumes that Yisrael must be talking about the killing of Achav, but that doesn't make any sense because that's right. That's a positive. So he says, so he quotes a pasuk in Malachim that Yisrael is where Achav did his worst evil. It's where Achav killed Navot Israeli because he wanted, right, through false witnesses or accepted Izevel's killing of Navot Israeli in order to get him Navots, Karam Navots. Okay, right. So that's his first chap that connects to that. And meanwhile, Rabbi Kaspi says some just utterly astonishing things about Nevuah that I think are worth sharing. First of all, let's just see what he says about Israel. He says, "Devei Israel, Hatam devei Navot shenherag bechelkata, bechelkato sheya bechelek Israel, al yidei Achav melech Israel." Right. So that's the blood is revenge is the blood of Achav. Im haskamot anshe ha'ir ugdolea, and he says not only was Achav complicit, but everyone around him was complicit. And that was an incredible sin, the worst sin for the king and all of Israel. So when Israel is destroyed, it's not because God is avenging the death of Achav on Yehu. It's God is avenging, even though Yehu killed Achav. At the end of the day, they never did tshuva. The kingdom never did tshuva, even if they had forget Avodah Zarah. The king never did tshuva for royal murder, and that's why everything is destroyed. And the only good thing that Yehud ever did was to kill Achav. In comparison to Nebuchadnezzar, who has some merit, but he's still a terrible person. Okay. He also says, right, Ibn Kaspi is one of those things where his view of prophecy is radical. He says this Navi, he thinks that if you really understand what this Nevuah is talking about, okay, he says this is all talking about terrible things to happen to the Jews. It's talking about the destruction of the 10 tribes, the exile of the 10 tribes. And then, but he says, but there are positive things. What are those positive things? One of them is talking about the success the Jews will have in the time of Hizkiah, and the other is talking about the success that we'll have in Bayit Sheni. But then he says, in the negative stuff, this Hoshea never gets to the details or descriptions the way Yeshaya does. Because Hoshea did not have the kind of focus that Yeshaya had that enabled him to see granularly the future. What he saw was 10 tribes to be destroyed. That Judah would survive for a brief bit. And then he saw afterwards, and he saw that we'd have some kind of success, and some kind of living in the land. And that's what this prophet says. And Hoshea didn't have a finer grained view. We have now been through history, right? That's Ibn Kaspa's playing. We who have been through history, we can understand what Hoshea was talking about. Hoshea himself didn't really understand what his words referred to. It's a wild, radical idea. Okay, I have one more. He gets that that Yisrael has to be meaningful every time, and so he gets that it has to be a way in which Yisrael changes meaning. Okay, so the first, right, so Yisrael is a symbol, and Yisrael negative comes from lizarot, to scatter, and Yisrael positive comes from lizroa, to sow and scatter, right? So that I think is the right. That's right. He says here, everything that happens at the end is exactly opposite what happened in the rebuke. Yisrael lo shina, but it keeps the name Yisrael, and the name Yisrael becomes a pun. Right, in the same way that I think Machlon and Kilyon and Megillat roots are a pun, and right, and they mean entirely different things. In the beginning, they mean disease and devastation, and in the end they mean hope, and I forget what I translated, hope and completion. Okay, I have only one last thing to say, and then we should take questions and comments. There's enormous amounts more to do, but I think that one more thing we'll do is I want to read Rabbi Aryeh Klapper. This is right. This is one of the Parshanim that we're finding more and more of, and again, incredible work by Ala Torah to uncover and to print the manuscripts in such an accessible form of all his Rishonim. So here's what he said: "V'katiyat d'mei Yisrael, damim sheshafach b'Yisrael, heim d'mei Achazyahu melech Yehuda." So the blood that Yehu spilled in Israel, he doesn't buy Ibn Kaspa's claim that it's talking about Navot, but here's what he does. It's the blood of Achazyahu melech Yehuda v'anashim harbei shelo hayu mizera Achav, and many people who were not descendants of Achav. Kilo amar lo hanavi lahachrit im mizera Achav. So he thinks that as opposed to right. So some people say he was right to wipe out Achav, but it turns retroactively into murder, because you can't kill people if you're not going to make things better, and that's, I think, a very powerful idea. And then Rabbi Yosef ben Kaspi says, no, it can't mean that at all. It has to mean that that it's going back to the innocent blood of Achav. And Rabbi Yosef ben Kaspi says, no, what it means is that he killed more people than he had to. Just because he had permission to wipe out Beit Achav doesn't mean he had permission to wipe out anybody else. And what he actually did was he killed Anashim Harbei Shelo Hayu Mizera Achav. He killed many people that weren't descendants of Achav. Kilo Amar Lo Hanavi Lachrit Ki Mizera Achav, because the prophet didn't tell him to wipe out anybody but Achav, and so in fact, the May Israel is imposed on the house of Yehu because they killed innocents. He says other people interpret this differently, and here's what they say: anybody whom God uses as his rod to chastise others, but that person is not themselves worthy. It's just that at this hour he has power, so eventually you'll get punished. Right, so that is right. So there are people who think that God sets up the world this way, that he causes wicked people to be his agent of chastisement, but then he punishes the wicked people for doing it. Right? This is where people have the interpretation like, why does Paro get punished for enslaving Israel if God promised they would be enslaved? Or the Ramban who talks about how if somebody escaped punishment, then for killing accidentally, so then God will arrange for those sorts. That maybe that's the same kind of issue. So he says, I know that some people will say, okay, you know what? It's fine for God to punish Yehu for killing Achav, even though God told him to, because that's the way God works. He says, that is not. He thinks that's just not true. You don't find this unless people are over enthusiastic. That God is a little bit angry. He uses that as excuse to let out his yitzhara. The kavanato I know So here's an ambiguity: is the reason that they're punished because they do too much, or because by doing too much they reveal that actually their intent was to murder? So that's a very deep theological question, which we talk about every year at Parsha Zachor, about whether intent is relevant in judging this action such as murder, or whether really all that matters fundamentally should be whether it was justified or unjustified objectively in terms of the other party. Did they need to die or deserve to die, however you want to frame it, and whether your intent really should be irrelevant. Okay, I think that is all that we have time for, but I will take whatever questions you have. Sorry, I ended up talking all the way through, but it really is helpful to me organizing my thoughts, even if I didn't stop as much as I might have suggested. Okay, questions?
Yeah. Do you have an overall understanding then of what Israel is in this section?
I think the most likely explanation, which I think that I think it was Yosef Kara had, is that Israel is deliberately ambivalent. It can have both positive and negative meanings. One of which comes from zara, and one of meaning to scatter, and one of them which means zera, which comes to sow. And the negative meanings are probably embedded also in whatever evil it was you think was done in Israel, but that the literary structure of what's going on is that you can see the reversal by within the name, that the same name can become good, that it's the transformation of God's relationship with Bnei Israel is embodied in the transformation of Yisrael from Yisrael to Yisrael. That's what I think is the most likely shot.
And do you see the relationship, that there is a relationship, I think you mentioned it, between Yisrael and Israel being so close, that Israel is some kind of distorted version of Israel, in whatever that means in terms of behavior or just whatever is going on, that and again, it represents Kingdom of Israel, but Kingdom of Israel is almost always, as the Kingdom of Israel, almost always evil. So it's not so different than just being a distorted version of what like a Beit Yisrael should be. Is there some kind of version of that going on, whereas in the end, what happens in the end is somehow, and again, I don't really know this is to be true, but somehow God is making his peace somehow, because there's some like meeting that Israel, this distorted thing, is somehow changed enough that God can still have a relationship at the end with it, and the lo ruchama can be converted back to ruchama, and lo, all that problem stuff can somehow be either lived with or invert, and like that's what's kind of some kind of story like that is going on. I think your commentators sort of say things like that, in a bigger
different visions, right? I think you have the vision which says that it could only happen if there's tshuva in the middle, right? That's Rashi's pshat, right? So that they say no, in which you can't say Israel is a distorted Israel. You have to say that Israel always has both possibilities in it from the beginning, and it's just sometimes Israel is the positive and sometimes the negative. Right? But if you take the reading that God always relates to the Jews as good, but it's Hoshea who originally thinks God should replace them, and then God teaches Hoshea you can't do that. So then you could say that Israel is Hoshea's distorted understanding. I guess you could claim that. And if you think it's what I think is the most radical reading, which is that it's God changing his mind, so then you would come with a reading like yours, right? That God comes to terms with his wife who committed adultery, the way it seems that Hoshea falls in love with Gomer, leaving aside the trajectory about when Gomer commits adultery and things like that. So then I think you end up with that vision, which is much darker. I think in some ways it's more cheerful in the sense that it sounds like God won't swap us out no matter what we do, but it's darker in that we're never deserving. I think then, right? I think if you take that position, then you would have to read it that way, that Israel means that that we never get to be the Israel we're supposed to be, but God comes to live with it. So I think that is a good description of what is at stake among the various commentators, the various commentators' impressions.
That's great. Thank you. I know nothing about Hoshea, and I really appreciate you're pointing this kind of thing out. This is kind of nice, for trying to figure this stuff out long term. What's going on. It sounds like really rich, but I hope someday I can get it.
Me too.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? All right then. I wish everyone a great. Marty, you have a question? No.
Did I turn video on? Oh,
Yeah.
Hi. No, and I'm thinking. No, I was just thinking that first of all, when you saw that, the two different meanings of Zara, I always thought that those as being the same, the same word, just two different connotations. I mean, not just the same three-letter shoresh, but you seed by scattering.
Yes, so I think that is correct in that it's not just a sound. It's not just a sound pun, but that I don't think you have to be referred to the two-letter roots to think that these are connected. And in a sense, you could use it as a response to a Seth's point and say, no, it's not. It wasn't a distortion because really it's always the same thing. I think that's very plausible. It's also possible there are other shorashim that people are connected to that I'm not. We didn't talk about Zara, for example, at all, right? Meaning alien, right? So it could have, but if I really wanted to strongly respond to Seth's point, I could say that since that really Zayin Reish Hey in terms of Yisrael is the thing that's off because it has an ayin.
Right, that's why.
Right. So really, you can say no. Really, the truth is Yisrael is Yisrael, and the distortion was Yisrael. I think that's correct. But I think it has to be clear that the naming of Yisrael has to be understood as negative when it's first given. Right? I don't think you can say that when Israel is born, everybody says, "Oh, good, Yisrael." That doesn't make any sense in context because it's right before Fakati Demei Israel and Vishavarti Keshet B'nei Yisrael B'nei Yisrael. So I think you have to at least have the Havamim. That is negative.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. That was was fun. It's always fun when I get to do tonight.
Right.
And hopefully see you all on Shavuos.
Okay, thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.